Let's explore the central nervous system. After you've completed this segment, you should be able to list the 4 regions of the brain and tell their general function, list the structures that protect the central nervous system, list the 3 meninges and tell their location, describe the function and flow of cerebrospinal fluid, describe the structure of the spinal cord, and you should be able to briefly describe homeostatic imbalances of the central nervous system. The central nervous system is composed of 2 major parts. The brain, which has 4 major divisions, the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. As we look at this cross-section of the brain, the cerebrum is this large superior portion. The diencephalon is located here, sort of in the center of the brain. The brainstem is up under everything else here. And the cerebellum is here behind the brain and up under the cerebrum. The cerebral hemispheres are the most superior and the largest part of the brain. It looks like there's lots of folds and ridges on it. The elevated ridges are referred to as gyri. Singular would be gyrus. The shallow grooves are sulci. Singular would be sulcus. And the deep grooves are fissures. Now the deepest of the grooves are the longitudinal fissure, and this is what divides the hemispheres, the cerebral hemispheres, up into the right and the left hemisphere. There are other less deep fissures in the brain, and they help divide the cerebrum up into the lobes. Now the lobes roughly parallel the bones of the skull. So under the frontal bone would be the frontal lobe. And in the frontal lobe we have the motor cortex, which is right here. And also located or housed in the frontal lobe are basics about personality and your decision-making powers. The parietal lobe would be more or less under the parietal bone. The sensory cortex is located here. The occipital lobe back here at the back of the brain, under the occipital bone, this is where the visual center is located. And the temporal lobe under the temporal bone, and your auditory center is located here. Now each part of the brain is much more complex than this. These are just the major functions of those lobes of the brain. The sensory and motor cortex, the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe and the sensory cortex is in the parietal lobe, are side by side like this. And we've drawn this little human body across them, and it looks kind of misshapen and out of place, but that's because the more the brain has to do to control a part of the body, or the more information it has to get from a part of the body, the more the brain is devoted to that part of the body. So for example, on your sensory side, the lips, very sensitive. And so a fairly good-sized chunk of your brain is devoted to evaluating sensation from your lips, also your face. Your hands, yes, but the trunk of your body not so sensitive. Right? Same is true about over here on the motor. You've got a big chunk of your face and mouth devoted to the motor cortex because you've got lots and lots of muscles that control chewing and facial expression and blinking and all kinds of things. Your hand, you've got good dexterity in your hand, but your arm, not so many muscles, not such great control. Your leg, not so many muscles, not such great control. So the more there is to control, or the more there is to get information from, the bigger the part of the brain that's devoted to that. Now besides those general areas, there are specialized areas of the brain where there's some overlap. More than one lobe contributes to these specialized areas. A couple that you hear about are Broca's area. Broca's area is your ability to form words. If this is damaged, you can't say words you want to say. Another area called the speech area, you can say words, but you can't select the words you want to use. So when you talk in sort of a language salad. Both of these are localized. That is, they tend to develop only on the left side of the brain in most people. If you have some sort of damage to the left side of the brain in either of these areas, you lose some of these abilities. But because the areas are on the right side of the brain, you can train the right side of the brain to pick this up. So people can learn to talk again if they lose that ability. The brain is organized with a shell of gray matter on the outside, and this is referred to as the cortex of the brain. And then there's a substantial amount of white matter on the inside. Now you remember, white matter is myelinated fibers, and groups of myelinated fibers in the central nervous system are referred to as tracts. And there are three major kinds of tracts inside the brain. You've got commissural fibers that connect one side of the brain to the other side of the brain. The largest of this commissural fiber group is a structure called the corpus callosum. Then you have association fibers. These connect different lobes of the brain on the same side of the brain. And you have projection fibers. These are the fibers that are bringing information into the brain or having information leave the brain. Then deep in the brain are little clusters of cell bodies, and you'll remember that cell bodies are gray matter and that they are called nuclei in the central nervous system. So these basal nuclei are little islands of gray matter embedded deep in the white matter. Now the basal nuclei are the ones that help coordinate motor activities. In Parkinson's disease, the basal nuclei don't produce enough of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. What happens is the basal nuclei help you start movements. Once you get the idea that you want to take a step or pick something up, it's the basal nuclei that lets you get that rolling. Well, if the basal nuclei are not producing enough dopamine, then you may be thinking about doing something, but it doesn't start right away. So people may have to stand for a moment before they take that step. They may have to hesitate for a moment before they pick up the spoon so they can start eating. Also, because the basal nuclei help smooth out movement a little bit, people with Parkinson's tend to have a tremor, they tend to shake a little bit. And dopamine is one of the brain chemicals that's a mood elevator. So this lack of dopamine means that people with Parkinson's disease tend to have some depression. There is another disease that affects the basal nuclei, and that is called Huntington's chorea. Now this is a genetic disorder. It is a dominant gene, so if one of your parents has Huntington's, you've got a 50% chance of having it yourself. This one, they produce too much dopamine, and as a result they start having jerky, uncontrolled movements that typically start in the arm. Eventually they affect the respiratory muscles and the mouth, and these people get to where they can't eat and they can't breathe appropriately. The treatment for this is to give them dopamine blockers to try to damp down the amount of dopamine that they're producing. The next part of the brain we want to talk about is the diencephalon. And there are three parts to the diencephalon. The thalamus is the center part. Pretty much everything coming into the brain goes through the thalamus. And in the thalamus we associate general feelings. Is it pleasant? Is it unpleasant? The hypothalamus makes up the floor of the diencephalon. Now, it's not a very big part of the brain, about as big as the tip of your little finger, but it is the major homeostatic center in your body. It has controls for temperature, thirst, osmotic pressure. All kinds of things are controlled as a result of homeostatic centers located here. The hypothalamus is also a part of the limbic system, and the limbic system is sometimes called your emotional visceral brain. Fear, rage, sex drive, those kinds of things are located in this part of the brain. Also, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, so this is a major controller of the endocrine system. The epithalamus is the roof of the diencephalon. Associated with the epithalamus is the pineal gland, which is an endocrine gland. It secretes melatonin and somehow is involved in our sleep-wake cycles. Also, the most prominent of the choroid plexuses is located here, and the choroid plexus is involved in the production of cerebrospinal fluid. The brainstem has several pieces to it. The reticular formation is a group of structures that are associated with the brainstem that help control the muscles of the organs of the body. Also part of the reticular formation is the reticular activating system. Now this is the part of your brain that keeps you alert and awake. If this part of the brain is damaged, this is one of the things that results in coma. The midbrain has associated with it the corpora quadrigemina. Now, in this particular area of the brain, you've got a few reflexive centers for vision and hearing. For example, that you tend to, if you think you see something out of the corner of your eye, you turn to look at it. If you think you hear a sound, you turn to look at it. Those are reflexes that are controlled by the corpora quadrigemina. The pons means bridge, and pretty much anything coming into the brain or leaving the brain goes through the pons. It's the pons that makes the connections about, does this go to the conscious brain, does this go to the unconscious brain? So it decides where impulses are going. Also, the pons can exert some control over the respiratory center. The medulla oblongata has in it your vital life centers. Your vital respiratory center, which controls breathing in, breathing out, and your cardiovascular centers, which control blood pressure and heart rate. The last part of the brain we're going to talk about is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is an unconscious part of the brain that plays a big role in motor coordination. It helps control your balance and posture. Also, it helps your conscious motor cortex plan all of your movements so that the movements come across just like you wanted them to. Nice, smooth movements. It makes sure that what you wanted to do matches what you actually do. If the cerebellum is damaged, you can have a condition called ataxia. People with ataxia are clumsy, they have disorganized movement, they really can't control their movements. If you're ever pulled over for DUI, one of the things they may have you do is close your eyes and touch your finger to your nose, and people with ataxia cannot do this. The brain is a pretty vital structure, so it is well protected. The vertebra protect the spinal cord and the skull protects the brain. And then there are membranes called meninges that cover the brain and the spinal cord. The outermost one is the dura mater, which is a very tough membrane. In the middle we have the arachnoid mater, which is loosely attached to the pia mater underneath, making it look like it's a spider web, hence the name arachnoid. And then the pia mater is a very thin, delicate membrane that directly adheres to the brain. The meninges can become inflamed, and then you have meningitis, and there are bacteria and viruses that can cause this. And while that's a significant disease, if the brain tissue itself is inflamed, then you have encephalitis, and that is a more significant condition. And the third protection we have to the central nervous system is the cerebrospinal fluid, or the CSF. So as we look at these layers, there's the bones of the skull. Then we have the dura mater, this thick, heavy layer. We have the arachnoid mater, and these little spiderwebby projections are attaching it to the pia mater. The pia mater is directly covering the brain. Floating in here, flowing in this area in what's called the subarachnoid space, is the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid acts as a waterbed for the brain, so it protects it from mechanical damage, but it also provides a very consistent chemical soup for the brain to float in it. Then that helps nourish some of the tissues and maintain chemical stability for the brain. There are hollow spaces in the brain that are called ventricles. And there's also a hollow space in the spinal cord called the central canal. Cerebrospinal fluid is formed with the assistance of the ependymal cells. Now, the ependymal cells line the ventricles and the central canal. They line those hollow spaces in the brain. And they're associated with a little cluster of blood vessels in the ventricles of the brain called the choroid plexus. The blood from the choroid plexus is filtered by the ependymal cells so that only certain quantities of various substances from the blood get into the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates in the ventricles of the brain and down the central canal, but in the fourth ventricle there are 3 openings into the subarachnoid space on the outside of the brain and spinal cord, and so cerebrospinal fluid can get out there to flow around the brain and spinal cord. After it's made its circuit, it's reabsorbed by the arachnoid villi, which are up in the top of the brain. So that these red things here are the choroid plexuses. These are 2 of the ventricles. There's a ventricle in each cerebral hemisphere. There's a ventricle in the diencephalon, and there's a ventricle right here between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So this fluid is formed here in the ventricles, flows around, flows down to the 4th ventricle. Some of it continues down the central canal, but a lot of it leaves the 4th ventricle and some of the openings in the 4th ventricle and get into the subarachnoid space where it flows all down the outside of the spinal cord and all around the outside of the brain. Now there's a collection of blood right here in that fissure, that longitudinal fissure of the brain, and the arachnoid villi, the arachnoid mater, projects up through the dura mater into this blood space. And because there's more pressure behind this fluid than there is in this blood space, the fluid is forced back into the blood. So it's filtered from the blood, circulates around the brain and spinal cord to protect it, and then returns back to the blood up here through the arachnoid villi. The spinal cord doesn't come all the way to the bottom of the lumbar region of the spinal cord. It stops at about L2. But the meninges do continue down. So you've got arachnoid mater and dura mater that come all the way down, which means that there's fluid down in this portion. And this allows for physicians to take a needle, go in between the vertebra, and puncture into this space right here. This is called a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. Fluid can be withdrawn and can be analyzed to see if there are chemical imbalances in the cerebrospinal fluid or blood in the cerebrospinal fluid, either of which would indicate some sort of pathology. Hydrocephalus is a condition where cerebrospinal fluid is either overproduced or it's not reabsorbed at a fast enough rate. Now in children, because they're born with those fontanelles and the bones are not fully fused, as we start making more fluid, the bones are simply pushed further apart and their head gets large, like this. In adults whose bones are already fused, we simply get pressure building up on the brain and they tend to get severe headaches. Either one, the pressure that's exerted by this extra fluid causes brain dysfunction. Now in infants, they can actually put a shunt in, a little tube that drains the extra fluid off into the peritoneal cavity, and this can prevent that from happening. In adults, they typically have to find why the cerebrospinal fluid's not being reabsorbed. A lot of times it's because of a tumor, and if they can remove the tumor, then the reabsorption picks back up like it's supposed to. Another protection, another chemical protection to the brain is the blood-brain barrier. Now, while the cerebrospinal fluid provides nutrients to the outside of the brain, there's a whole lot of the inside of the brain that also has to get nutrition, and that comes from blood vessels that penetrate the brain and go by all of the cells in the brain. Just like we have problems with chemical imbalances in the cerebrospinal fluid, we want to make sure that we don't get those chemical imbalances going directly to the brain tissue. One of the things that helps us out is the capillaries that go to the brain are some of the most impermeable capillaries in the body. They don't have a lot of spaces between the cells, so it's very hard for material to get out of the blood and into the surrounding tissue. The other thing is the brain has those astrocytes. and the astrocytes go out and wrap extra protection around the blood vessels, so that not only do we have to get stuff to go through the blood vessel wall, we also have to let it diffuse through the astrocyte cell to get into the brain tissue. The astrocytes are the most abundant of the neuroglia because they have to wrap every single capillary in the body or in the brain. The only part of the brain that does not have a blood-brain barrier is the hypothalamus, and that's because the hypothalamus has to pay attention to changes in the blood. It's part of its homeostatic mechanism. Now, the blood-brain barrier is useless against anything that's fat-soluble because all of the cell membranes, remember, are basically lipids. So anything that's fat-soluble will just pass right through here. Alcohol is fat-soluble, so alcohol can get directly into the brain tissue, and it is toxic to brain cells. Traumatic brain injuries are probably one of the leading causes of brain dysfunctions. Now, a lot of people get concussions if they get a pretty good rap on the head. With a concussion, you may feel dizzy and see stars. You may have a headache for a while, but there typically is not any permanent brain damage. You possibly lose consciousness, but don't necessarily have to lose consciousness. If the blow to the head is significant, you will have a brain contusion. Contusion is another word for bruise. Now, this means that there has been some tissue destruction, and you could possibly go into a coma. Because it may take a while for this to develop, people with head injuries are usually retained in the hospital for overnight to make sure that they don't lapse into a coma. If they are sent home, they're usually sent home with the instructions that someone should try to wake them up every hour or so to make sure that you can wake them up. If they get difficult to wake up, they need to go back to the hospital because potentially they're starting to go into a coma. A cerebral hemorrhage is when one of the blood vessels in the brain ruptures and blood leaks out into the surrounding tissue. A clot is going to form, that's a hematoma, and as the clot forms, it can put pressure on part of the brain. Nervous system tissue does not like pressure. If you've ever sat on your foot till your foot went to sleep, you know it didn't take very much pressure before you impeded nerve transmission. The longer that goes on, the more likely you are to do permanent damage to the tissue. So anything that puts pressure on nervous tissue, no matter where it is, potentially can cause damage. Symptoms of cerebral hemorrhage will depend a lot on where the bleed occurs. For example, if it occurs in the motor cortex, you may lose function of an arm or a leg. If it occurs in a sensory cortex area, you may lose the ability to feel something. Cerebral edema can occur basically from any brain damage. This is when the brain tissues fill with fluid and the brain swells. As the brain swells, because it's enclosed in the skull, pressure is going to be put on the brain. And of course, this can cause permanent brain damage, can cause comas. They do things like give steroids to reduce the swelling of the brain. In terms of degeneration of the brain tissue, cerebrovascular accidents, CVAs, or as they're better known, strokes, are probably one of the leading causes of degenerative brain diseases. With a stroke, there is an interrupted blood flow to the brain. And remember, brain tissue requires a lot of oxygen and nutrients to maintain that ATP supply, so even a minimal blood flow problem can cause some changes in brain activity. Now, the interrupted blood flow could either be because of a bleed in the brain with a clot, with a hemorrhage, or a clot can block one of the blood vessels. The most common is probably the clot, but either one can occur. Now, again, the symptoms depend on what area of the brain is not getting a blood supply. If it's, say, the occipital lobe, you may have visual problems. If it's the temporal lobe, you may have hearing difficulties. So it just depends on what area of the brain is not getting blood as to what symptoms you see. TIAs, or transient ischemic attacks, are when there are blood interruptions or decline in blood flow to a part of the brain, and there will be some numbness or tingling in a limb or some sort of indication that something's not quite right with your nervous system. About 30% of people with TIAs will go ahead and have strokes within the next 5 years. So having TIAs is not an automatic you're going to have a stroke, but having TIAs is a good indication that you should be checked out. Make sure that you're doing everything you can to help prevent a stroke. There are a lot of medications that are on the market to help with strokes, and some people are not very compliant with those. They'll think, oh, I'll just have a stroke and die. The only problem with that is about 70% of the people who have strokes don't die, but they are left not able to care for themselves. So if somebody is telling you they're not on their medication that might prevent a stroke, you might remind them that no, they don't necessarily die. They will just be unable to care for themselves. Another degenerative brain disease is Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is a disease where there's memory loss, and there's also mood changes. People who have been very sweet suddenly may become combative. When they look at the brains on autopsy, they see that there are these tangled protein deposits in the brain called neurofibrillary tangles. We don't really know exactly what causes them. Areas of the brain atrophy, particularly those areas associated with memory. The cause of Alzheimer's disease at this time is unknown, but there is a familial tendency. They have isolated a couple of genes that tend to lead to the neurofibrillary tangles developing, but not all Alzheimer's has a genetic link. Okay, let's check out how we're doing so far. The part of the brain involved in conscious activity is the cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon, or brainstem. It's the cerebrum. All of the other parts of the brain are unconscious. You don't really register what goes there, nor do you consciously think and make things happen out of those parts of the brain. Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease both involve the cerebellum, the diencephalon, the basal nuclei, or the brainstem. This one's the basal nuclei. Both of them are problems with dopamine. Huntington's, you make too much. Parkinson's, you don't make enough. Now, while the cerebellum does help with motor control, it's the basal nuclei that are involved in these two diseases. The central nervous system is protected by the meninges, the skeletal system, the cerebrospinal fluid, or all of them. And of course, all three of these contribute to the protection of the central nervous system. Vital centers for respiration and cardiovascular activity are located in the cerebellum, the cerebrum, the brainstem, or the diencephalon. This one's the brainstem. The brainstem is the hardest part of the brain to get to. It's the hardest part to damage, but that's one reason we think that those vital centers are located there. Let's talk about the spinal cord. The spinal cord is the part of the central nervous system that is involved in transmitting information to and from the brain. It's about 17 inches long, so it does not extend all the way down the vertebra. Stops at about L2. It is surrounded by the meninges. There is a bulge on it called the cervical enlargement up in the neck region because a lot of nerves come off of this area to go down the arms. And there is also a swelling on it in the lumbar region because a number of nerves come off to go down the legs. Attached to the spinal cord are the 31 pair of spinal nerves. Not all of them can come straight off the cord and leave through the openings in the vertebra. Some of them have to go down through the central canal of the vertebra and come off, and that little clustering of nerves that come off the bottom is called the cauda equina, or the horse's tail. So that if we look at the spinal cord, you can see it extends down and stops about there. And you see the spinal nerves coming off to the sides, all the way down. The cervical enlargement, right here, because several nerves come off to go down the arms. And the lumbar enlargement right here, because several nerves come off to go down the legs, including these that come down here. Now the cauda equina is that group of nerves that come off up here. but have to travel down a ways before they can exit at the appropriate level. So this is your horse's tail, or your cauda equina. On your spinal nerves, you have the cervical nerves, 8 pair, 12 pair of thoracic nerves, 5 pair of lumbar nerves, 5 pair of sacral nerves that come off the holes in the sacrum, and 1 little coccygeal nerve. In terms of the construction of the spinal cord has white matter on the outside, and remember, in the central nervous system, that's called tracts. Those are clusters or groupings of myelinated fibers. Some of them are ascending tracts because they're carrying sensory information up. Some are descending tracts because they're carrying motor information down. Sensory goes into the brain, motor comes out of the brain. You find them in the front, the back, and to the side of the spinal cord. So you have anterior tracts, posterior tracts, and lateral tracts. The gray matter is clustered to the inside and really looks a little bit like a butterfly. So you have the anterior horn, the posterior horn, and in the thoracic region you have a little lateral horn. So if we look here, your posterior column, your lateral column, and your anterior column, these would all be white matter. And then here's your gray matter, this butterfly on the inside. So you have your posterior horn, your anterior horn, and in the thoracic region you have a little lateral horn here. Now the spinal nerves carry both sensory and motor information, sensory in, motor out. And just as they get close to the cord, the sensory information splits off on this dorsal root, and the motor information is carried on this ventral root. They merge then to make the spinal nerve that leaves the vertebral column. Sensory is input, motor is output. So the posterior horn here is going to deal with sensory information, and the anterior horn here will deal with motor information. And there's your spinal nerve. If the nerves do not send information to the muscles, then you're going to have paralysis. So not all paralysis has anything to do with the muscles. It has more to do with the nerves that tell the muscles to contract. If there's damage to the ventral root, that means that all of the motor information that would be carried on that root, on that particular spinal nerve, will not be transmitted. So the muscles won't receive any stimuli, and they won't even have muscle tone. So that's flaccid paralysis. If the cord is transected or cut, then you're going to have spastic paralysis. Remember, the spinal cord is the mediator for a number of reflexes. So the reflexes will still work, but they won't have any control to them. You'll just have jerks and reflexive motions that are not really in response to any stimuli necessarily. You'll also have loss of sensation because if the cord is completely cut, sensory information won't be going up, motor information won't be coming down. Everything stops at the cut place. Now if the cut is in the cervical region, then all of the limbs will be affected. That's called quadriplegia. If the cut is somewhere below T1, then only the legs will be affected, and that's called paraplegia. Okay. If the spinal in the spinal cord, sensory information is carried in which? The ascending tracts, descending tracts, ventral root, or cauda equina. Sensory information is input, so it's going to be in the ascending tracts. That's got to go to the brain. Motor information will be in the descending tracts and also leaves along the ventral root. If the spinal cord is transected in the thoracic region, it would cause flaccid paralysis, ataxia, paraplegia, or quadriplegia. It's going to cause paraplegia. In the thoracic region, we're not going to send information to the legs only. The arms will still be getting information, so it will be quadriplegia. Ataxia is if the cerebellum is damaged, and flaccid paralysis is if the ventral root is damaged.